Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history gets strange but the voice stays calm. Tonight, you'll drift into the oldest stories of the far north, a world where the wind had a name, trees had opinions, and the sky was never entirely silent. This is the entire story of Norse mythology, from creation out of nothing to the world's quiet rebirth after its own destruction. Before you settle in, maybe dim the lights or let a small hum of white noise fill the room. If you're still awake enough, take a slow breath. Picture cold air from a northern sea brushing across your face, sharp, clean, and a little timeless. That's roughly what the first storytellers felt when they began to speak of the gods. They didn't read myths from books. They heard them sung beside firelight, mixed with the smell of burning pine and wet wool. Every myth we know from this world survives by accident, saved in a few poems, some carved stones, and a 13th century scholar who apparently didn't know when to stop writing footnotes. It's a reminder that mythology isn't built to last, it's built to be retold. Tonight, we'll wander through that entire web of retellings, how runes, archaeology, and medieval ink piece together a cosmos of ice and fire, gods and giants, birth and death, ending and renewal. You'll meet Odin, who traded an eye for knowledge and still complained about the price. You'll hear about Thor, whose subtlety was mostly stored elsewhere. You'll meet Freyja, Loki, and the quiet seeresses who held more authority than kings, though no one liked to admit it. But before any of them existed, there were stones, and before stones, there was silence. If your mind drifts while listening, that's fine. We'll still be here, gently unfolding the story. Let's begin in the stillness, where the earth itself remembers what people forgot. You start not with thunder, but with mud. The North has a way of keeping things, swords, shoes, entire ships, as if time there refuses to move without permission. Archaeologists like to say that Scandinavia's bogs are anaerobic environments. What they mean is they are very good at hoarding secrets. Down there in black water, thick as old ink, lie the remains of the first northern offerings. Broken shields, bent spears, pieces of armour dropped deliberately. Not lost, but given. Warriors came home from battle and threw their best weapons into lakes, as if saying to the gods, "Thanks, but please don't notice me next time." The pattern repeats for centuries. You find heaps of swords, warped and useless by design. Archaeologists once puzzled over the waste until they realised the destruction itself was devotion. If you wanted to honour a weapon, you didn't polish it, you killed it. Somewhere nearby, a ship rests beneath the earth. The Oseberg vessel, a marvel of curved oak ribs and carved serpent heads, was buried not to sail, but to wait. Inside, 2 women were laid out with silks, carts, and animals. A ship that could have conquered seas was sent to conquer silence instead. The air inside their burial chamber still smells faintly of tar and linen. Ship burials appear all over Scandinavia. The idea was simple and strangely comforting. If life is a voyage, death is just a change of harbour. The sea, always hungry, was both friend and border guard. Beyond the graves, picture stones stand tall across Gotland and Sweden, flat slabs carved with swirling scenes. Ships sail across their surfaces, warriors rise towards suns with rays shaped like ropes. When the light slants just right, the carvings glow as if they've caught the last sunset of the Viking Age. These stones are as close as we get to Norse cinema, still frames from stories that no longer have soundtracks. Later came the runestones, carved during the Viking Age itself. They were public announcements, messages from families, not priests. "Thor bless these words," one reads. "Raised in memory of my brother," says another. The stones were once painted red and blue, glowing like lanterns against the pale countryside. Time washed the colour away, but not the voices beneath. One of the earliest is the Rök stone, towering above a field in Sweden. Its sides are covered in hundreds of runes wrapped like vines. For years, no one fully understood them. Now, scholars think the text may mourn a dead son, and worry about a coming darkness that sounds eerily like Ragnarok. Some call it the earliest record of climate anxiety, a father carving his fear of endless winter after strange cold summers. The stone reads like prophecy, but feels like grief. Further south, in Denmark, the Jelling stones stand as the nation's birth certificate. One proclaims, King Harald made the Danes Christian. It's both royal boast and historical memo. On its side, Christ stretches his arms in a style suspiciously close to a pagan figure. It's the theological version of covering all bets. Runes, ships, bogs, they all tell the same story. Long before ink and parchment, people here trusted the world itself to remember for them. Stones were their notebooks, earth their archive. Each carving, each burial, each offering whispers the same quiet confidence. The gods may be watching, but so is the landscape. When later poets tried to reconstruct this mythology, they weren't inventing from nothing. They were reading what the soil had already written. Every sword in the mud, every rune in the stone was a footnote in a much older book. So when you picture Norse mythology, don't start with Valhalla or Thor's hammer. Start with the sound of a chisel on granite, echoing over frost. Somewhere, centuries ago, a craftsman paused, rubbed his hands and thought, "This will last." And somehow, it did. The stones kept their promises longer than the kingdoms that built them, and out of those promises, the myths begin to rise again, slow, shimmering and cold as dawn on the fjord. If the stones were the bones of memory, the words carved upon them were its heartbeat. Somewhere between the 5th and 12th centuries, Northern Europe discovered that thoughts could live outside the mind, if you cut them deep enough. The runes were more than letters. They were a compromise between magic and paperwork. Each rune carried sound, meaning and charm. To carve one was not just to write, but to make an announcement to the universe. The earliest forms, known later as the Elder Futhark, had 24 characters, clear, sharp shapes meant for the stubborn grain of wood and stone. By the Viking Age, this alphabet had been reduced to 16, simpler, faster and easier to carve after dark when storytelling usually happened. Efficiency was a virtue even in the sacred. Runes appear everywhere, on weapons, combs, jewellery and stones taller than houses. Some read like prayers, others are closer to gossip. "I carved these runes," says one proud inscription, which is roughly the medieval version of signing your graffiti. Another, on a small piece of bone, declares that the carver loved someone. The earliest known Scandinavian love note still preserved by a patient museum. They wrote for memory, but also for power. Runes were believed to shape events. Odin himself, the great magician of the pantheon, was said to have discovered them after hanging from the world tree for 9 nights. It's the mythic version of postgraduate study, long, painful, and probably not worth the tuition. But his reward was knowledge, the ability to see language as a bridge between intention and reality. In that sense, every rune carved by a human hand was a small imitation of divine craft. The most striking pieces of evidence sit quietly in Danish and Swedish fields. The Jelling stones, for example, show how runes became tools of authority. King Harald Bluetooth, who decided Denmark needed both unity and better marketing, raised a massive stone proclaiming that he had made the Danes Christian. On another face, Christ stretches his arms, but his body twists in a way that looks suspiciously pagan. Scholars argue about symbolism. To everyone else, it's a neat example of ancient public relations, a monument that works for both sides. Farther north, the Røk stone carries the oldest long text in runes, hundreds of characters etched across multiple sides. For centuries, no one could read it clearly. Its sentences curl and cross like braided rope. Some say it honours a dead son, others think it hides a riddle about heroes, the sun and cosmic doom. A recent theory claims it was written after a strange cold spell around the 6th century, when the sun dimmed and crops failed. Maybe the carver felt that darkness wasn't just weather, but destiny. In that sense, the rook stone might be humanity's first apocalypse carved in code. When you stand before it, today the stone is tall, plain and quiet. Birds land on it without ceremony. But if you trace your fingers over the grooves, you can almost feel the rhythm of a chisel, steady and slow. Every cut is a heartbeat saying, "Remember this." Eventually those beats turned into rhythm, not of hammer on stone, but of words on breath. Oral poetry became the new storage system. Bards known as skalds carried stories across generations. They were the walking hard drives of the North, each one memorizing thousands of lines. In long halls lit by smoke and mead, they performed verses that braided memory and myth. Every sound was both entertainment and record-keeping. The great poems of the poetic Edda, like Völuspá and Havamal, were composed this way, spoken long before they were ever written down. In them, you hear a world of opposites, creation and collapse, pride and punishment, wisdom and the weary knowledge that everything ends. When these verses finally made it onto parchment in medieval Iceland, they carried centuries of oral drift, like waves reshaping coastline before freezing into map form. Then came Snorri Sturluson, the scholar who couldn't resist organising the unorganisable. In the 13th century he wrote the prose Edda, part textbook, part mythological survival guide. Snorri wanted poets to understand their heritage without accidentally worshipping it. So he explained myths, indexed metaphors, and footnoted the gods into coherence. Ironically, his attempt to demystify paganism preserved it instead. The man who tried to make mythology safe for students ended up keeping it alive for scholars. What's remarkable is how much survived through sheer stubbornness of medium. Runes lasted because granite is patient. Poems endured because voices are persuasive. And manuscripts endured because monks, whether they liked it or not, copied everything. The result is a strange miracle of continuity. Bits of ink, stone, and memory linking farmers in Iron Age Denmark to readers in the age of the internet. When you put all this evidence together, the bogs, the runestones, the verses, you realise that Norse mythology wasn't invented in a single moment. It was built slowly, like frost forming patterns on glass. Each generation added a breath, a story, a correction, a warning. Some of it was religious, some poetic, some deeply practical. You can feel that practicality in every line. The gods may die, but the words will survive them. So when the myths speak of creation out of nothingness, you can imagine the poets smiling slightly. They knew their world had already created something from nothing, a written voice carved out of silence that would never entirely fade. Somewhere between stone and song, myth learned how to remember itself. And through that strange act of memory, the universe of ice and fire was born. When you open the medieval sources of Norse mythology, you expect thunder and dragons, but what greets you first is a scholar with a quill. His name was Snorri Sturluson, a lawyer, historian, and part-time myth curator from 13th century Iceland. Snorri wasn't alive when anyone still believed in Odin. He wrote about the gods the way a modern accountant might describe a circus he's only read about. His work, the prose Edda, has survived for 800 years, and still manages to sound as if he's politely apologising for every sentence. He begins his text with a question disguised as a story. If there is now only one god, where did all those older gods come from? Snorri's answer is impressively diplomatic. He suggests they were once real people, powerful kings or clever explorers who were mistaken for divine beings after their deaths. It's a theory later scholars called euhemerism, but you can think of it as historical spin. It allowed Christian Iceland to discuss pagan myths without needing to wash afterward. Snorri's Edda is a masterpiece of unintended preservation. He built it as a textbook for poets, explaining how old kennings, those metaphorical phrases like whale road for the sea, had once referred to myths. He wanted to keep the poetic craft alive even as belief itself faded. What he didn't realise is that by teaching future writers how to decorate poems with ancient metaphors, he kept the myths themselves breathing inside those decorations. The gods survived as literary footnotes. The poetic Edda, a separate collection of anonymous verse, worked differently. Those poems, Völuspá, Havamal, Grimnismal, were older, oral, and haunting. They speak in fragments, riddles, and prophecies. In Völuspá, a seeress tells the story of the world from its birth to its destruction, as if reading minutes from a meeting that keeps recurring. Havamal presents Odin dispensing wisdom that sounds oddly like advice from someone who's made every mistake twice. Together, these poems reveal a cosmos both organised and exhausted, where creation and collapse are two sides of the same tired sigh. What makes these texts remarkable isn't only their content but their tone. Unlike the mythologies of Greece or Rome, which love order and narrative clarity, Norse stories are allergic to straight lines. The gods are powerful but mortal. Heroes win but still die. Even the universe seems to run on sarcasm. In that sense, Snorri's effort to categorise it all was like trying to nail fog to a wall. Still, his prose has a rhythm that feels oddly comforting. Between the lists of names and genealogies, you sense an affection for the chaos he's taming. He describes the world's creation out of a void called Ginnungagap, a space between fire and ice where nothing yet existed. Then he moves briskly to Ymir, the first giant, who emerges from the melting frost like an unplanned experiment. From Ymir's body, the gods build the world. Bones become mountains, blood becomes seas, skull becomes sky. Snorri writes this without drama, as if noting household repairs. The effect is strangely modern. His universe runs on conversion and recycling. The divine act of creation is also a clean-up operation. When he tells of the sun and moon being chased across the sky by wolves, it's not a metaphor for doom, it's quality control. Everything in his mythic architecture has a job description, even chaos. You can feel that same practical poetry in the kennings he explains. For Snorri, calling the sea the whale's road or gold the serpent's bed wasn't just decoration, it was memory disguised as style. Each metaphor carried a tiny myth inside it, a reference waiting to be unpacked. When the metaphor survived, so did the world they hinted at. In a way, Snorri invented one of history's most effective backup systems. Store your religion inside your literature, and no one can quite delete it. Behind his tidy prose, though, you can glimpse a deeper anxiety, the sense of writing at the edge of forgetting. Iceland in Snorri's time was Christian, literate and legally minded, but the echoes of the old belief still clung to the landscape. Waterfalls, mountains and stones carried local names that refused to convert. Even as he wrote about Odin as a former king, Snorri must have known that somewhere, farmers still poured out ale to the land spirits when the harvest looked uncertain. He was documenting a culture that hadn't fully decided whether it was over. That tension gives his work its peculiar warmth. The Edda isn't nostalgic exactly. It's more like a man labelling boxes in an attic so future generations can find their way through the clutter. His system of categories, the creation stories, the family of gods, the catalogue of poetic terms, became the foundation for every later reconstruction of Norse myth. Archaeologists dig up graves and runestones, but readers dig up Snorri. There's irony in how much we owe him. Without his tidy explanations, we might have lost half the myths we now take for granted. But his Christian filter also reshaped what he preserved. The gods he describes sound strangely moral, almost managerial. Their tragedies echo biblical cadences. Baldur's death feels like a Nordic echo of the New Testament, complete with innocence, betrayal and prophecy. It's hard to tell where old pagan voices end and medieval theology begins, yet perhaps that blending is the most authentic thing about it. Myths are not fossils, they're rivers. They change course depending on the terrain. Snorri's version of the old faith isn't wrong. It's what survival looked like in the 13th century. When you read the Eddas now, you can feel that mixture of order and melancholy. The poets are rebuilding the cosmos with grammar instead of gods. The stones have turned into sentences, the sacrifices into syntax. And yet, beneath all that neatness, the original wilderness still murmurs, the wind between lines, the chill between words. So when we speak of Norse mythology today, we're really speaking through two translators, the skald who sang and the scholar who filed. Between them stretches 600 years of memory, forgetting and rediscovery. Together they left us a world that refuses to stay tidy, a universe where even language has frostbite. From those carefully written pages, the myths spread outward again. From parchment to imagination, from Iceland to everywhere, stories travel. And soon, that vast, restless universe of ice and fire begins to take shape in the mind's eye, waiting to explain how something was made out of nothing and how nothing keeps trying to come back. Before there were gods, or humans, or even the idea of storytelling, there was nothing. Not the cozy, candle-lit nothing you imagine when you close your eyes. This was the kind of nothing that hums. A silent, enormous pause called Ginnungagap, which roughly translates to the yawning void. It sat between two extremes, the frozen realm of Niflheim to the north and the fiery expanse of Muspelheim to the south. You could think of it as the universe before the universe realised it should probably tidy up. Niflheim was made of mist and frost, a place where even light seemed to move reluctantly. Muspelheim was its opposite, all flame and heat, ruled by a being named Surtur who carried a sword of fire. When their borders breathed toward each other, ice met flame, and the world's first chemistry experiment began. The melting frost dripped into the void and formed shapes that twitched and lived. Out of that unstable mixture came Ymir, the first giant, the original accident. Ymir wasn't handsome. He was enormous, damp, and continuously melting. When he slept, other beings grew from his body, male, female, and sometimes both. It was less genealogy, or spontaneous reproduction via cosmic confusion. Around him flowed rivers of milk from the great cow Audumbla, who licked salt blocks to pass the time. On the third day, as she licked one particularly promising block, the shape of a man emerged, Buri, the ancestor of the gods. It's a creation story that begins with poor ventilation and ends with genealogy, proving once again that mythmakers never waste material. Buri had a son named Bor, and Bor married Bestla, a giant's daughter. Their children were Odin, Vili and Ve, the first gods who looked at Ymir's enormous body and saw both opportunity and storage space. They killed him, partly out of practicality, partly out of aesthetic preference. From Ymir's flesh they shaped the earth. From his blood they poured the seas, from his bones they raised the mountains, and from his skull they made the sky. It was recycling taken to a theological extreme. The gods even positioned sparks from Muspelheim across the new ceiling, inventing stars because darkness was getting depressing. What makes this creation myth quietly moving is how physical it is. There's no elegant command like, let there be light. There's labour, chopping, shaping, arranging. Creation happens not through words, but through work. You can almost hear the scrape of tools, the hiss of cooling stone, the slow sigh of a cosmos finding its structure. In this world, divine craftsmanship and manual labour are the same thing. Once the landscape existed, the gods decided it needed atmosphere. They placed the sun and moon in the sky, but since this universe prefers chaos with a sense of humour, both were chased by wolves. Skirl pursued the sun, Hati chased the moon. Day and night weren't cycles so much as endurance tests. Every sunrise was temporary victory, every sunset an ongoing retreat. In a sense, the cosmos was designed for suspense. Even the measure of time felt different here. The Norse didn't see time as a straight road stretching ahead. It was more like a circle drawn in frost, temporary, fading, and redrawn again. The seasons returned, the world aged, died, and restarted. They lived in what you might call looped existence, though they probably describe it as simply normal. It's a worldview shaped by long winters and short summers, the recognition that everything repeats and that repetition is a kind of endurance. From their high vantage, the gods built Midgard, the middle enclosure, a safe ring where humans could live without getting immediately eaten or frozen. Around it sprawled Jotunheim, the land of giants, a reminder that danger was never far, only politely distant. Between them lay the sea, the world's largest social boundary. It's telling that in this mythology, the ocean is made from Ymir's blood. The barrier that divides you from the unknown is literally the residue of an ancient disaster. Some myths say that after crafting the world, the gods found 2 tree trunks on a beach, ash and elm. They carved them into the first humans, Asker and Embla, giving them breath, mind, and warmth. It's an image that feels almost tender, divinity kneeling beside driftwood, whispering life into it. The world, in other words, begins not from perfection, but from debris. It's easy to think of these stories as quaint, but they hold a rough kind of logic. In a land of extremes, fire in volcanoes, ice in glaciers, creation and destruction were not opposites, but neighbours. Every farm depended on the same balance. Too much warmth, the crops burned. Too much cold, they vanished. The people who told these stories understood fragility. Their gods didn't hover above nature. They worked inside it, sometimes successfully, often not. Later poets and chroniclers would interpret all this as metaphor, a cosmic allegory for good and evil, order and chaos. But in its oldest form, the myth reads more like field notes on existence. The world was made from contradictions, and therefore it would always wobble. Life was temporary, but beautiful in its precision. Frost meeting flame, light outrunning darkness, creation always a little unfinished. You can almost imagine a storyteller explaining it by firelight, shrugging slightly after each incredible detail. Yes, he'd say, the first being was made from melting ice and cow saliva. Yes, the sun is being chased by wolves. That's just how it is. And the audience, half drunk and half frozen, would nod in perfect agreement. Because when the wind outside howled like something hungry, the story felt true enough. The beauty of Ginnungagap lies in what it implies, that the void was never entirely empty. It was waiting, quietly, for imbalance. Creation didn't require perfection, it required collision. And from that first collision, everything else would learn how to exist. So when you next hear the crack of ice on a winter morning or watch steam rise from something newly forged, you're witnessing a very old ritual, the endless replay of the universe remembering how it began. A moment where cold meets heat, silence meets breath, and nothing becomes something once again. Creation, in the Norse imagination, was a team effort built mostly on poor planning and excellent recycling. Once the gods had finished murdering Ymir, they were left with a mountain of cosmic leftovers. And because divine beings dislike clutter as much as anyone, they began to build. The world was shaped like a grand act of tidying up, the first and only time cleaning counted as creation. They stretched Ymir's vast skin into plains, hammered his bones into mountains, and poured his blood into the deep hollows that became oceans. The clouds were made from his breath, the stars from sparks they stole from the realm of fire, and the sky, broad, silent and curved, was his skull turned upside down. Somewhere, a poet once said that the gods set the skull of Ymir up to be the heavens. It's an image both magnificent and deeply uncomfortable. Every time you look up, you're staring at a dead giant's forehead. In the ancient language of myth, this wasn't morbid, it was practical. Nothing was wasted, not even catastrophe. The world itself was evidence that destruction could be reused. The gods were the universe's first architects, working entirely with recycled materials. It's oddly comforting. Your house might leak, your roof might sag, but at least it wasn't built from an ex-giant. Once they had a surface to stand on, the gods began to define its edges. They raised the sky on 4 distant points: north, south, east, and west, each held up by a dwarf with an unreasonably literal name: Nordri, Sudri, Ostri, and Vestri. You don't need to be fluent in Old Norse to guess what they mean. Somewhere out there, the 4 dwarfs are still doing their job holding up the horizon like underpaid interns. The world they built was divided into layers or realms, each connected by strange bridges of light and imagination. At the centre stood Midgard, the middle enclosure where humans would eventually live. Around it, like an untidy neighbourhood map, sprawled the other realms: Asgard for the gods, Jotunheim for the giants, Alfheim for the elves, and so on. Between them all arched Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, a shimmering highway of colour that connected heaven and earth. It wasn't just pretty, it was the divine commute route. The gods then realised they needed a cosmic centrepiece, something to bind the worlds together. So they imagined Yggdrasil, the world tree, its roots buried deep in unseen wells, its branches touching the heavens. It was less a tree and more an organising principle. Everything depended on it. Gods held councils beneath its leaves, serpents gnawed its roots, and an argumentative squirrel named Ratatosk ran messages between the top and the bottom, proving that even in divine ecosystems, gossip is eternal. What's remarkable is how physical all of this feels. The Norse world wasn't abstract or distant, it was tactile, a structure you could picture, even smell. It had texture, sap, and noise. It creaked, hissed, and whispered. The myth doesn't separate matter from spirit. It suggests they are the same thing. Wood, bone, water, and wind all contain will. Creation wasn't a speech act. It was an act of craftsmanship. And yet, beneath the humour of building a sky from a skull and a bridge from light, there's a certain quiet humility. These gods, powerful as they were, lived in a world they couldn't fully control. Even the structure they designed was fragile. Giants lurked beyond its edges, wolves chased the sun and moon, and serpents coiled around the roots of the tree waiting for the next collapse. Order existed, but only temporarily. This sense of impermanence seeps into every layer of Norse thought. The world is beautiful because it's unfinished. The gods maintain it the way one maintains a roof in winter, patch by patch, never expecting it to last. Their enemies are not evil but inevitable: frost, fire, hunger, pride. The myths never promise a permanent paradise. They promise maintenance, and sometimes that's enough. Somewhere beneath this grand cosmic construction lies a deeper logic. Ymir's body becomes the template for the universe, not just because he was large, but because his death created space. It's an ancient metaphor for transformation, the idea that existence requires sacrifice. Even in modern terms, energy becomes matter only by conversion. The old poets, of course, wouldn't have called it physics. They would have said the gods simply cleaned up after chaos. And then, once the landscape was set, the gods turned their attention to us, the small, breath-filled creatures meant to inhabit the middle world. They found 2 tree trunks on a shoreline, ash and elm, stripped smooth by waves. From them, they shaped the first humans, giving them breath, consciousness and warmth. The names Asker and Embla are simple, like the act itself. They weren't sculpted from marble or born from divinity, they were carved from wood, which, considering how many winters they'd have to endure, feels both poetic and practical. The world they woke into was vast and slightly terrifying. Above them hung a skull full of stars, around them seas made from blood. But it was also alive, Rivers sang, trees whispered, and every gust of wind was a reminder that even emptiness had a pulse. The Norse cosmos is often described as 9 worlds, but it might be more accurate to call it 9 versions of the same conversation. Fire arguing with ice, order negotiating with chaos, creation refusing to stay finished. To live within it was to balance between extremes, trusting that even if the bridge burned, someone would rebuild it in the morning. And in this precarious balance, humanity took its first breath, shaped from trees, born into uncertainty, destined to tell stories about why everything leaks. If the previous session was about the moment nothing became something, this one is about what that something turned into. A world made from contradictions, stitched together by necessity and held in place by a mixture of courage and curiosity. When you look up at the night sky now, clear, cold, and vast, you're still looking through a mere skull. The stars are just sparks from an ancient forge, and the quiet between them is the same silence that once hummed before anything existed at all. The world hasn't forgotten how it began. It just keeps pretending to be new. If the world was built from bone and breath, then time was its fabric. And somewhere, beyond even the gods' control, 3 women sat weaving it. They were called the Norns, and they lived at the base of the world tree, near a sacred well where fate itself was said to collect like dew. Their names, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, roughly mean what was, what is, and what will be. Together they managed the impossible task of keeping eternity on schedule. The Norns didn't ask for permission. Even Odin, with all his wisdom, bowed his head when he walked past their loom. Each strand they spun held the life of someone, mortal or divine. The gods might argue, fight, or delay their fates, but they couldn't rewrite them. It's a quietly terrifying thought. Even immortals worked under management. In the old stories, time wasn't a line, it was a pattern. The Norns didn't write events in order, they wove them together, past folding into present, future fraying into memory. A Norse poet once described fate as something laid down, not written. It wasn't a prophecy to read, it was a texture you could feel. Every snowstorm, every harvest, every sword stroke had already been woven somewhere, waiting to reach the visible world. The well beside them was called Urd's Well, and each day the Norns watered Yggdrasil with it to keep the tree alive. You can imagine the sound, soft trickle, leaves whispering above, the rustle of thread through fingers. It's not thunder or spectacle, just the sound of maintenance again. In this mythology, creation doesn't end, it continues as care. The world isn't self-sustaining, it survives because someone tends it. This sense of continuous weaving runs deep in Northern imagination. Even human life was measured like cloth. A newborn was said to have a new thread added to the loom. A warrior's thread could be cut mid-battle, snapped by one of the Norns in a gesture both arbitrary and absolute. People didn't say someone died too soon. They said his thread was short. Fate wasn't cruel, just busy. You can almost picture them in their quiet corner under the tree. 3 women who never age, never sleep, and never quite finish. One spins, one measures, one cuts. Sometimes, perhaps, they pause, watching the gods above them brag and stumble, and share a small, knowing smile. They already know how those stories end. Even Yggdrasil itself isn't exempt. Its roots are gnawed by the dragon Nidhogg, its bark dries in harsh winds, its branches creak under the weight of worlds. But every morning the Norns pour water and white clay over its roots, healing what was damaged overnight. It's a simple, humble act, divine gardening at the scale of the cosmos. The symbolism is quietly profound. The universe depends not on grand acts of creation, but on endless small gestures of repair. Fate and upkeep are the same thing. The gods can forge stars and fight monsters, but the Norns keep everything from unravelling. And yet, the gods still try to understand the pattern. Odin, restless as always, seeks knowledge from every source. The dead, the living, even himself. He sacrifices an eye at Mimir's well, trading vision for insight. He hangs from Yggdrasil for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, seeking the runes that reveal how reality holds together. It's a grim kind of curiosity. Learning hurts, literally. But that's Odin's defining trait. He values wisdom more than comfort. He understands that knowing how the pattern works doesn't mean you can change it. It just means you'll recognize your own end when it arrives. This is perhaps the strangest thing about Norse mythology, its acceptance of inevitability. In other traditions, knowledge grants control. Here, it only grants clarity. Odin learns everything, how the world was made, how it will end, even who kills whom at Ragnarok, and still moves toward it. There's a dignity in that kind of futility. The Norns, meanwhile, remain neutral. They're not cruel, they're cosmic clerks, recording and adjusting as needed. Some legends say there are more than 3, countless minor Norns, each assigned to a person or place. They weave weather, luck, and the odd coincidence that changes everything. It's a bureaucracy of destiny. Even your small triumphs and disasters might have a signature, somewhere deep beneath the tree. For people in the north, this view of fate wasn't depressing, it was liberating. If the pattern was already woven, then courage meant acting anyway. A warrior didn't fight to escape death, but to meet it well. A farmer didn't plant crops because success was guaranteed, but because hope was a habit. The Norns made the rules. Humans turned them into meaning. There's something hauntingly modern in that outlook. We still live inside invisible systems, weather, history, economics, time, that move whether we agree or not. We talk about threads of connection and cutting ties as if our language remembers them. Maybe it does. Every metaphor for destiny we use comes from that old loom, still spinning in the dark. If you listen closely to the quiet moments in life, the hum of a refrigerator at night, the ticking of a clock, rain on the roof, you can almost hear that rhythm. It's the sound of continuity, soft and stubborn. The Norns are still weaving, unbothered by disbelief. They don't need worshippers, they have eternity. Some say even they will vanish when Ragnarok comes, their loom torn apart by the collapse of all things. But that's only half the story. The world, after all, begins again afterward. Someone somewhere must pick up the threads. Perhaps that's the secret comfort of this mythology. It never stops at destruction. It believes in rebuilding, in weaving again, maybe with the same fibres, maybe with new ones. So, when the frost gathers on a window and patterns appear overnight, spirals, branches, endless filigree, it's easy to imagine that the Norns are still at work, leaving a reminder that everything is connected and everything continues, at least for a while. If the Norns wove time, then Yggdrasil was what held it together. The world tree was not just a symbol or a metaphor. In the Norse imagination, it was the skeleton of existence, a living axis that reached through every layer of reality, roots tangled in the underworld, branches brushing against heaven, trunk standing in the middle where everything that breathes must pass. You could say it was the first shared workspace between gods, giants, and anything else with unfinished business. No one knew exactly what kind of tree it was. Some said ash, some said yew. The poems are unclear, which might be deliberate. A way of saying that Yggdrasil is whatever holds your world upright. What mattered was that it lived. It creaked and groaned, leaves whispering in the wind of centuries. At its base lay wells of wisdom and fate. In its branches nested creatures both majestic and ridiculous, including a large unnamed eagle, several dragons, and one small squirrel who refused to mind his own business. The squirrel's name was Ratatosk. His full-time job was to carry insults between the eagle at the top and the dragon Nidhogg at the roots. He scurried up and down the trunk reporting, every petty remark with dedication. It's easy to laugh, but there's something strangely realistic about it. Even in a myth about cosmic order, there's still room for gossip. Apparently, the universe needs both balance and entertainment. Yggdrasil connected the 9 worlds of Norse cosmology, a structure less like a ladder and more like a nervous system. At the highest level sat Asgard, the realm of the gods, gleaming and well managed. Below it was Midgard, the middle enclosure of humankind, ringed by oceans and danger. Beyond were the other domains, Alfheim of the Light Elves, Svartalfheim of the Dark Elves, Jotunheim of the Giants, Niflheim of Ice, Muspelheim of Fire, Vanaheim of the Older Gods, and Hel, the quiet realm of the dead. Each world touched the tree differently, feeding or draining it. Its sap carried news between realms the way rivers carry rumours. Sometimes the gods climbed it, sometimes they fell from it. Odin once hung himself from its branches for 9 nights to learn the runes, speared and alone, offering himself to himself, a piece of divine performance art in exchange for wisdom. His discovery wasn't just magical letters, it was the understanding that everything, even pain, could be translated into meaning. The tree wasn't paradise, it was a workplace, a battlefield, and a library all at once. Beneath its roots, the dragon Nidhogg chewed endlessly, trying to bring it down. In the Well of Fate, the Norns watered it daily, keeping it alive. Deer nibbled its leaves, serpents tangled its lower branches. It was constantly being damaged and repaired, which made it the perfect symbol for life itself. Durable, because it's never entirely intact. Sometimes poets described Yggdrasil trembling when great events unfolded, not because it was afraid, but because everything that happened, every death, every oath, every broken promise, sent vibrations up its trunk. It was the nervous system of destiny. When a king fell in battle, when a farmer buried his dead child, when a storm destroyed a village, the tree shuddered softly, recording the moment in rings of unseen memory. In that way, Yggdrasil was more than a map of space. It was a living calendar. The growth of its branches mirrored the expansion of time itself. To the people who imagined it, the cosmos wasn't infinite. It was alive, and like all living things, it aged. The tree had roots in the past, trunk in the present, and branches reaching into futures no one could quite see. This idea of a living structure holding reality together appears in many cultures, but the Norse version is particularly grounded. There are no shining angels in its branches, no flawless symmetry. Yggdrasil is a little messy. It leaks sap. It needs watering. It creaks under pressure, and that makes it human. It reminds you that even perfection requires upkeep. There's a kind of comfort in imagining the universe as a tree rather than a machine. Machines break and stop. Trees bend, scar, and keep growing. The world tree suggests that existence isn't about precision, but persistence. You don't have to understand how everything connects. You just have to trust that it does. The 9 worlds, though distinct, constantly overlap. Gods visit humans. Giants invade divine realms. Elves drift invisibly through both. The Rainbow Bridge Bifrost connects them all, a trembling arch of colour stretching between Midgard and Asgard. The poets say it hums when gods walk upon it and crackles when thunder rolls. It's the closest thing to a northern highway, beautiful but unstable. Someday, they say, it will burn. But for now, it shines. If you were to stand at the base of Yggdrasil, you'd hear many sounds at once. Water trickling from Urd's well, wind through leaves, the distant clang of forges in dwarf halls, faint mutters from the dead below. You might also hear Ratatosk's claws on bark, his cheerful delivery of yet another insult. It would sound alive in every direction, vertical, horizontal, eternal, and if you could climb it, past storms and stars, through branches that smell of sap and eternity, you'd eventually reach the eagle's nest. From there, you'd see the world spinning like dewdrops on leaves. You might even notice that the whole thing trembles slightly, like something breathing. That's the heartbeat of the cosmos. Not steady, but real. To the Norse poets, this vision of the world wasn't abstract philosophy, it was reassurance. The idea that life, messy, painful, fragile, still rests on something living. The tree may shiver, but it stands. And even if dragons gnaw at its roots, even if gossiping squirrels spread discontent, it endures because someone keeps watering it, day after day, without applause. Maybe that's why Yggdrasil remains one of the most enduring images in mythology. It doesn't promise peace or perfection, it promises connection. It tells you that every joy, loss, and silence is part of the same structure. A thread in bark, a whisper in leaves, a ring of growth after fire. And somewhere, in that slow rhythm of growth and decay, you realise the tree isn't just holding the worlds up, it's holding them together. By now the world had settled into a fragile balance. The mountains stood, the seas remember their boundaries, and humanity had learned the art of worrying about weather. But among the gods, one figure refused to rest. Odin, the All-Father, king of Asgard, seemed allergic to contentment. Where others saw a functioning universe, he saw a puzzle missing most of its pieces. He wanted to know everything, the future, the secrets of life and death, the hidden logic that ran beneath the surface of fate. It wasn't enough to rule, he had to understand. Some called this wisdom, others quietly called it obsession. Odin's search began with a transaction that would have impressed any modern negotiator. At Mimir's well, a deep pool said to contain the memory of all things. He asked for a drink. Mimir, the guardian of the well, replied in the polite tone of someone about to overcharge. "It costs one eye," he said. And Odin, without hesitation, plucked out his own. The story doesn't mention which one, perhaps because losing half your vision isn't the dramatic part. It's that he considered it a bargain. He drank, and in that cold water he saw what others could not. Fragments of the past, whispers of the future, the slow unravelling of the god's own power. Knowledge, it turns out, is not a comfort beverage. Yet Odin drank deeply, even as the wind hissed through the socket where his eye used to be. You might imagine that such enlightenment would satisfy him. It didn't. Soon he wanted more, the kind of knowledge that couldn't be bought, only earned. So he turned upward to the world tree Yggdrasil and decided to learn its secrets the hard way. He hung himself from its branches, pierced by his own spear, for 9 nights and 9 days. Alone, starving, half dead, he stared into the abyss below and waited for meaning to blink first. The Eddas describe it in quiet detail. Odin hanging there, offering himself to himself, suspended between life and death. No one fed him, no one pitied him. On the 9th night, the runes revealed themselves, signs of power carved into the structure of the world. He saw that words could change reality, that symbols could shape fate. And in a final whisper of understanding, he fell, clutching the knowledge like a fever dream. When he returned to Asgard, he brought with him the runes, letters, spells, prayers, and commands all at once. They were language made alive, proof that wisdom was not found in comfort, but in sacrifice. Yet even that wasn't enough. Odin's hunger for insight became an addiction. He sent his 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, to fly across the world each day and bring back reports. They perched on his shoulders and whispered news into his ears. It was an early version of surveillance technology, powered entirely by feathers and guilt. Still, Odin worried they might not return. Every morning as the ravens took off, he wondered aloud which one he'd lose first, thought or memory. It's one of the oldest recorded cases of anxiety. For all his power, the god of wisdom spent his days haunted by what he might forget. He also had a taste for disguise. To learn from mortals and gods alike, he wandered the world cloaked as a traveller, long beard, hood, one eye glinting like a coin in the dark. He visited kings and peasants, asking riddles, offering strange advice, and occasionally starting wars just to see what would happen. To some, he was a wise wanderer. To others, a polite nightmare. Wherever he went, stories followed like footprints. There's a strange kind of comfort in Odin's madness. He's the god who proves that curiosity is both sacred and self-destructive. His sacrifices make sense to anyone who's ever stayed up too late chasing answers they didn't really want. Wisdom, in his world, isn't illumination, it's exposure. You see everything, including the inevitable end. The myths never describe him as peaceful. Even in triumph, he frowns. Knowing the future doesn't make it better. It just makes it unavoidable. He foresees Ragnarok, the end of the gods, and spends eternity preparing for it, gathering heroes, studying runes, training armies. He's the first being in history to experience burnout on a cosmic scale. The other gods respect him but keep a safe distance. At feasts, when Odin's ravens land nearby and start whispering world news, the conversation tends to stop. Thor rolls his eyes. Freyja quietly refills her cup. Even Loki, professional troublemaker, looks uneasy. There's something unsettling about a man who trades body parts for enlightenment and calls it a hobby. And yet, Odin's restlessness keeps the mythic world alive. Without his questions, the stories would stagnate. He's the friction that prevents eternity from becoming boring. The runes he discovered, those simple, angular marks, are the very reason anything in this mythology survives. They're carved into stones, sung in charms, whispered in prayers. Every poem, every inscription, every storyteller repeating these tales owes a debt to the god who thought hanging himself from a tree was a reasonable learning method. When the wind rushes through pine forests or hums along the hulls of ships, you can almost hear the echo of his sacrifice. It's the sound of knowledge arriving late and staying forever. Odin's story ends where it began, with the same uneasy truth, that wisdom costs more than anyone can afford, and yet everyone keeps trying to buy it. He walks the halls of Asgard surrounded by information, insight and premonition, and still looks unsatisfied. Because what he really seeks isn't knowledge itself, it's reassurance. And no amount of foresight can give him that. So he keeps asking, keeps searching, keeps trading pieces of himself for fragments of the truth. Somewhere in the cold distance, the ravens circle, gathering tomorrow's headlines. Their wings cut through the wind like turning pages. Odin lifts his head, listening. Another secret arrives, and he prepares to pay again. Where Odin brooded, Thor preferred to hit things. If Odin was the god who thought too much, Thor was the one who didn't think quite enough. And that, oddly, made him popular. In a pantheon full of schemers, poets and prophets, Thor stood for something refreshingly uncomplicated. Hit the problem until it behaves. He was the protector of gods and humans alike, armed with a hammer that could flatten mountains and, on slower days, egos. His hammer Mjolnir wasn't just a weapon, it was an identity. Forged by dwarfs in their underground forges, it had a short handle thanks to a manufacturing error which only made Thor swing it harder. He used it to bless weddings, hallow graves, and occasionally demolish architecture. Where Odin sought meaning, Thor preferred measurable results, ideally measured in decibels. The myths call him the Thunder God, but that undersells his job description. Thunder was merely the side effect of his commute. Every time he drove his chariot across the sky, pulled by two goats named Tangrisnir and Tangjosta, whose names mean snarler and grinder because subtlety wasn't invited. The sound of their hooves became storms. Lightning flashed whenever he threw Mjolnir, and rain followed like applause. Despite his cosmic role, Thor's personality was disarmingly human. He had a temper, a fondness for strong drink, and the kind of self-confidence usually reserved for people who've never read philosophy. He was brave to the point of recklessness, loyal to a fault, and deeply suspicious of anything involving reading riddles or small talk. The sagas love to show him in action, usually at the edge of comedy. In one tale, he loses his hammer, a disaster roughly equivalent to the sun misplacing itself. The culprit is a giant named Thrym, who demands the goddess Freyja's hand in marriage as ransom. Instead of starting a war, Thor takes advice from Loki, always a warning sign, and disguises himself as Freyja to attend the wedding. Wearing a bridal veil and a bad attitude, he sits through the ceremony until the moment Mjolnir is brought out to bless the union. Then he grabs it, and still in full wedding attire proceeds to redecorate the hall by force. The story is ridiculous, which is exactly the point. Thor's strength is both his gift and his joke. He's divine muscle played for laughs, the embodiment of protection through excess. He's what happens when sincerity meets overkill, and people loved him for it. In an unpredictable world, Thor represented the possibility that problems could still be solved directly, that some things really did yield to brute force and good intentions. Another story has him go fishing with a giant. Naturally, he brings an ox's head as bait. When the line goes taut, it's because he's hooked Jormungandr, the world's serpent that circles the ocean. The two struggle until Thor nearly drags the serpent up, its jaws gaping wide enough to swallow continents. Just as he's about to land the catch of eternity, the giant panics and cuts the line. Thor throws his hammer after the serpent, the sea boils, thunder rolls, but the serpent escapes. Somewhere, Odin sighs. That scene, Thor straining against the serpent in the middle of a storm, became one of the most enduring images in Northern art. It's more than an action shot. It's a miniature of the entire Norse worldview. Order versus chaos, strength versus inevitability, all locked in an endless draw. No victory lasts. Even gods get interrupted. Thor's devotion to duty wasn't limited to battles. He was the protector of farmers, travellers, and anyone who couldn't afford divine subtlety. His hammer symbol appeared on amulets worn by ordinary people, often shaped from iron or silver. When Christianity spread, the cross began to replace these charms. But for a while, both symbols were worn together, perhaps as insurance. You might say it was the medieval version of a double coverage. Despite his reputation for simplicity, Thor wasn't cruel. His strength came with an odd tenderness. He killed giants not out of hatred, but out of necessity, to keep the fragile order intact. And when he wasn't swinging his hammer, he was busy eating. His goats, the same ones that pulled his chariot, could be slaughtered and eaten each night as long as their bones remained unbroken. In the morning, he'd bless the remains and they'd stand up alive again, slightly annoyed. It's an efficient meal plan with built-in leftovers. For all his might, Thor also had limits. He couldn't cross certain rivers, couldn't outwit certain tricks, couldn't stop time from grinding forward. His power was loud but temporary, the thunderclap between storms. That's part of why he was so beloved. He wasn't untouchable. He was dependable. When Odin's wisdom felt too distant and Loki's cleverness too slippery, Thor remained solid, familiar, human-shaped in his flaws. You can still feel that appeal today. Every time lightning flickers or a storm rattles the windows, it feels personal, like the old protector is still on patrol. His hammer became a symbol of defense, resilience, and occasionally frustration. People invoked him for strength, not serenity. When diplomacy fails, try a hammer the size of modesty itself. Thor's stories are loud, but underneath them runs a quieter rhythm. The idea that noise itself can be holy. The clash of thunder, the strike of iron, the pulse of rain, all reminders that the world is alive and occasionally needs to shout. And so, when the sky darkens and wind builds in your ears, imagine that somewhere above the clouds, two goats pull a chariot through the storm. A hammer arcs in silver light. The sound that follows is both laughter and warning, the universe clearing its throat. Of course, even thunder needs chaos to stay interesting. Every well-behaved universe eventually needs a saboteur, and for the Norse gods, that role was filled by Loki. He wasn't a god of war or harvest or poetry. He was the god of what happens when you leave the lid slightly off the jar of reality. His official title changes depending on who's telling the story. Trickster, shapeshifter, problem solver, problem causer, but his main function was to make sure nothing ever stayed peaceful for long. Loki's origin was already suspicious. He was born among the giants but charmed his way into the company of the gods, which says a lot about both parties. To the Aesir, he was useful. He could fix problems that required deceit, improvisation, or the occasional theft. To himself, he was merely proving that chaos was a more flexible career path than virtue. He was clever, dangerously so. Where Odin sought wisdom and Thor relied on strength, Loki preferred loopholes. He could talk his way out of nearly anything, except the consequences. His stories all follow the same rhythm. A disaster starts with something he says, spirals wildly, and somehow ends with him saving the day, usually to repair the mess he made in the first place. It's the mythic equivalent of setting a fire so you can heroically put it out. Take, for example, the story of how the gods got their most prized treasures. After Loki caused one of his usual catastrophes, cutting off Sif's golden hair, for reasons no one remembers but everyone regrets, he had to make amends. He visited the dwarves, master smiths of the underworld, and persuaded them to craft new wonders. Sif's hair made of real gold, Odin's spear that never missed, Frey's ship that could fold into a pocket, and Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. The hammer came out perfect, except for the handle being too short, a flaw caused by Loki's interference during the forging. Even when he helped, the universe stayed slightly crooked. That was his trademark. Everything Loki touched became a reminder that perfection is unstable. He was the wild card in a world obsessed with fate. If the Norns represented the threads of destiny, Loki was the one who kept tying them into knots. His humour was part of his danger. He mocked the gods not out of rebellion but boredom. In one famous feast, he insulted each of them in turn, exposing their secrets like a guest who's had too much mead and just discovered honesty. To Odin, he sneered that wisdom was only useful if it could prevent suffering, which it couldn't. To Thor, he pointed out that a hammer couldn't fix loneliness. He even accused Freyja of vanity and Freyja of recklessness. It was a masterclass in social suicide, but he delivered it with such charm that half the hall laughed before remembering they hated him. Yet Loki's mischief wasn't random. Beneath the jokes ran a dark curiosity. What happens when truth slips its leash? He seemed to test the limits of divine order, forcing the gods to confront what they preferred to ignore. Their hypocrisy, their dependence on violence, their fear of endings. In that sense, Loki wasn't the enemy of Asgard. He was its mirror. He made sure they never forgot how fragile their order was. Of course, that kind of role doesn't win popularity contests. The gods tolerated him as long as his chaos stayed useful. But myths have a habit of escalating. Loki's tricks grew sharper. He fathered 3 children who terrified even the bravest. Fenrir, the wolf destined to devour Odin. Jormungandr, the world serpent fated to fight Thor. And Hel, the ruler of the underworld. It's as if his imagination gave birth to the universe's worst-case scenarios. The gods reacted with predictable panic. They chained Fenrir, cast Jormungandr into the sea, and banished Hel to rule over the dead. Loki watched all this with something like amusement or heartbreak. It's hard to tell with him. Maybe he was proud, maybe horrified, or maybe he just understood that creation and destruction were related, and someone had to play the unpopular role. Eventually his mischief went too far. When Balder, the beloved son of Odin, was killed by a mistletoe dart, it was Loki who orchestrated the tragedy. He didn't throw the dart himself, that would be too obvious. Instead, he guided the hand of another god, making the act look accidental. It was a masterpiece of cruelty disguised as curiosity, and it broke the last of Asgard's patience. For this, he was hunted, captured, and bound in a cave with the entrails of his own son. A serpent hung above him, dripping venom onto his face. His wife, Sigyn, stood beside him, holding a bowl to catch the drops, but whenever she turned to empty it, the poison fell, and Loki writhed so violently that earthquakes were said to follow. Even in punishment, the world still moved to his rhythm. The strange thing about Loki's imprisonment is how inevitable it feels. From the beginning, he was moving toward this. The gods needed someone to blame for their anxieties, and Loki, clever, slippery, fearless, volunteered by existing. Without him, the myths would lose their tension, their questions, their laughter. He was the necessary discomfort in a universe addicted to order. It's tempting to moralize, to call him evil or tragic. But Loki's real significance lies in what he reveals, that chaos is not a flaw in the system, it's part of its design. Every world, whether divine or human, needs something unpredictable to keep it alive. Without the trickster, even paradise would rot from boredom. So when the firelight flickers, when laughter feels a little too sharp, when curiosity crosses the line into danger, that's Loki's echo. He's the whisper reminding you that perfection is suspicious, and that even the gods can't build a universe without cracks. And yet, the gods will miss him when he's gone. Because the day Loki stops smiling is the day the world stops moving. But even chaos, it turns out, has family drama. After all the noise of thunder, war and mischief, the next story moves more quietly. Like perfume in air or light through smoke. It belongs to Freyja, goddess of love, magic and things that refuse to stay in their assigned categories. She is one of the Vanir, the older race of gods who made peace with the Aesir after a long and confusing war. Where Odin ruled through knowledge and Thor through strength, Freyja ruled through the art of influence, the kind that worked without announcing itself. Her world was full of paradox. She could stir desire, inspire battle frenzy, or lead the dead to her hall, Folkvanga, where half of those slain in combat went, the other half going to Odin's Valhalla. It was a perfect bureaucratic division of the afterlife. But Freyja's power extended beyond beauty or death. She was the keeper of Cider, the ancient trance magic that blurred the line between prophecy and possession. Cider was not performed, it was entered. A practitioner would sit or stand, sometimes on a platform or within a circle, surrounded by chanting and the smell of burning herbs. The world would shift, colours deeper, sounds longer, time slowed like honey dripping from a spoon. In that state, the seeress could see into minds, twist outcomes, or speak with spirits. Archaeologists later found iron staffs buried with women who may have practiced it. One grave at Firkat held a curved rod, seeds of hallucinogenic herbs, and a brooch shaped like a bird. Evidence that the performance of magic was also theatre, complete with costume and prop. Freyja was its divine master, but she shared her art with others, including Odin, who learned it from her. This caused a scandal among the gods. Cider was considered a woman's craft, emotional and unrestrained, and for a man to practice it was seen as shameful. Odin did it anyway, because wisdom rarely asks for permission. The irony of a war god worrying about social norms would have been funny if it weren't so revealing. The divine patriarch borrowed power from the goddess of desire, and then quietly pretended it was his idea. Freyja didn't mind. She seemed to understand that real influence never announces itself. She moved through the myths like a shadow with purpose, weeping tears that turned to gold, trading a knight's favour for a necklace made by dwarves, crying for her lost husband Odd, who wandered the world disguised and forgotten. Her emotions were not weaknesses, They were catalysts. Every act of longing in her stories changes the balance of power somewhere. If you were to stand near her ritual, you'd smell the herbs, mugwort, henbane, and perhaps a trace of pine sap. You'd hear low chanting, drum beats mimicking a heartbeat. The seeress's voice would rise and fall, guiding the rhythm of breath. For listeners, it might sound hypnotic. For the gods, it was strategic. Freyja's magic wasn't about conquest, but conversation, with the unseen, with possibility, with whatever part of reality still listens. In this mythology, magic and gender are woven together. The women who practiced Seder were both revered and feared. They crossed boundaries between male and female roles, between the living and the dead, between the ordinary and the divine. Power in Norse thought was never neutral. It had texture, and Freyja knew how to shape it like clay. Her chariot, unlike Thor's thundering one, was pulled by cats, creatures that move as if the world exists for their amusement. She rode through the sky wrapped in falcon feathers, crossing realms with silent precision. If Thor was noise, Freyja was the pause afterward. The myths hint that even the fiercest warriors softened their tone when she entered a room. People prayed to her for love, fertility, and safe childbirth, but also for cunning, the ability to persuade when strength failed. Farmers offered her grain, warriors offered half their victories. She was the balance in a culture obsessed with battle, proof that not all power needs to shout. Even the gods, who laughed at her tears or envied her beauty, relied on her. When they needed someone to negotiate, they sent Freyja. When they needed an object retrieved, a curse lifted, or a heart softened, they called her name. She didn't solve problems the way Thor did, with a hammer, but her results were usually cleaner and involved less collateral damage. And yet, her stories often end with solitude. For all her charm and strength, she is constantly waiting. For Odd to return, for peace to last, for her arts to be understood instead of feared. The poets describe her crying gold. It's an image that sounds lovely until you remember that crying is still crying. In her glittering sorrow, she embodies the truth that emotion and endurance are not opposites but partners. There's a quiet echo of realism here. Love, in the Norse imagination, isn't eternal joy. It's persistence through loss. Magic isn't control, it's communication with what can't be controlled. Freyja's world is the emotional middle ground between war and silence, the hum that keeps existence tuned. You can feel that hum in every description of Seder. The drum beats fade, the chanting stops, but something remains, a vibration that refuses to disappear. It's the sound of connection, of something fragile holding together. Maybe that's why her art was feared. It reminded everyone that stability depends on emotion, and emotion refuses to follow rules. When the northern wind moves through pines at dusk, you can almost hear her language. Low, rhythmic, patient. Not thunder, not fire, just a steady whisper. The sound of someone who knows that influence isn't about control, but timing. Odin may have sought truth by pain, and Thor by noise, but Freyja found it in resonance. The soft pull that changes hearts before anyone notices. She was the teacher of gods and the uncredited author of balance, and where her songs ended, another story began. The journey of those who followed her into the next world, carried by wind and wave, toward a silence that promised not an end, but a voyage. For a people surrounded by sea, death was never imagined as stillness. It was a journey, another kind of voyage, and the ship was both vehicle and coffin. The Norse saw water as the one road that never ended. It led away from the world of the living, but somehow looped back again in mist and tide. When a person died, the living didn't bury them so much as launch them. The most famous of these send-offs happened long before the sagas were written. The Osberg ship, buried in Norway around the 9th century, carried 2 women, one older, one younger, resting among silks, carts, carved animals, and household treasures. The ship itself was a masterpiece of curved oak, its prow spiralling like a frozen wave. Whoever those women were, they were powerful enough to sail into eternity with furniture and fine linens. Archaeologists later called them priestesses, or perhaps queens. The truth doesn't matter, the gesture does. They weren't simply buried, they were given motion. Farther south, another burial, the Gokstad ship, held a man with weapons, shields, and 3 smaller boats stacked inside like dreams within dreams. His companions were horses, dogs, and birds. Even in death he didn't travel alone. When the grave mound was sealed, the wind above must have whistled through its grass like waves across an invisible sea. Each of these burials carries the same idea, that the dead continue to move, and the living must equip them properly. Some were set adrift on actual boats pushed into fjords, others were burned on pyres shaped like ships. Fire and water, the twin paths to elsewhere. The smoke rising to the sky, the ashes drifting out on the tide, both meant the same thing, a safe passage, a completed circle. The myths reflect this sense of motion. There were many destinations after death, depending on how one lived. Warriors who died in battle might be chosen by the Valkyries, shining figures who rode through storms collecting the fallen. Half went to Odin's hall, Valhalla, where endless feasts and practice battles filled eternity, an afterlife that sounded heroic but slightly exhausting. The other half went to Freyja's hall, Folkvanga, quieter, softer, perhaps a place where glory finally got to rest. Farmers, craftsmen, and those who died in peace often went to Hel, the realm ruled by Loki's daughter of the same name. Despite later confusion, her kingdom wasn't punishment. It was simply continuity, an underworld of shadows where life continued at a lower volume. There was no single heaven or hell, only destinations suited to temperament. The Norse imagined the afterlife as an extension of life's diversity. Courage was honoured, but so was perseverance. Even the quiet had somewhere to go. You can feel the texture of this belief in their graves. Some were grand, ships buried under mounds, swords arranged beside bones, coins pressed into palms. Others were modest, a handful of beads, a clay lamp, a piece of bread. But the impulse was the same. Send them off with something useful. No one travels empty-handed. Sometimes, the offerings crossed into magic. Small charms or runes were placed near the dead, not to protect them from monsters, but to help them remember themselves on the other side. Memory, to the Norse mind, was the real treasure. To forget one's name would be the second death. And so, funerary rituals were less about mourning and more about continuity. The living performed their tasks carefully, knowing the boundary between worlds was porous. The flames of a pyre might be seen as light in another realm. The sea that swallowed a ship might deliver it somewhere better. There's a quiet poetry in this practical spirituality. To believe the dead keep travelling is to believe that motion itself is sacred. The same wind that filled sails could carry souls. The same water that fed fields could also erase footprints. Nothing was ever entirely lost, only transformed. You can almost picture it. Night on a fjord, stars mirrored on the water. A wooden boat drifts away from shore, its single torch reflecting across the waves. On land, people stand silent, faces lit by gold fire, until the light dwindles to a spark and vanishes. They turn back to their homes, but part of them keeps listening, for the sound of oars somewhere beyond hearing. This vision of death as travel wasn't just comfort, it shaped ethics. To die well was to depart bravely. To live well was to prepare for the voyage, to be the kind of person whose story would keep sailing after them. That's why the sagas care so much about memory and reputation. To be forgotten was to sink. To be remembered was to keep moving. Even archaeology whispers the same lesson. The soil in old burial mounds smells faintly of pine and iron, the ghosts of timber and weaponry. When those graves were opened, after centuries of silence, the air inside was still, but not dead. It carried a kind of waiting, as if the journey had paused rather than ended. In that sense, the Norse didn't separate life and death sharply. They existed on a continuum joined by wind, wave, and story. The same gods who ruled the living cared for the departed. The same landscape served both: mountains, forests, sea. Every grave was a harbour, every storm a reminder. Even the famous female warrior buried at Birka, whose bones proved later to be those of a woman rather than a man, fits this worldview. The identity didn't matter. What mattered was readiness. The sword, the game pieces, the horses. She was equipped, therefore eternal. So when you think of Viking funerals, the flames, the boats, the long silence afterward, imagine them not as final spectacles but as continuations. The dead were simply changing a dress. You can hear this faith in their language too. The old word for death shares roots with to go. No final stop, only departure. And somewhere beyond that horizon, the ship is still moving, carrying its quiet cargo of names, memories, and promises toward a shore that never stops shifting in the dark. But even death was only an intermission. The Norse believed that every story, even one that started with ice and fire, would eventually end the same way, in cold and silence. The word they used was Fimbul Winter, the great winter before the end of all things. It wasn't a season, it was a sentence. 3 years of snow without summer, winds sharper than language, the sky a grey lid, the world a dim lamp slowly burning out. They didn't imagine it as punishment, only inevitability. Just as spring follows winter, so must collapse follow creation. The same frost that gave birth to the first giant would one day take everything back. The poets described it calmly, as though they'd seen long winters and decided one more wouldn't make much difference. But there was something deeper in their vision. Memory. Around the 6th century, a real climate disaster darkened northern skies for years. Volcanic ash or something worse blocked the sun. Crops failed, animals starved, and the air carried a cold that didn't belong to any season. The Uruk runestone carved centuries later seems to remember that darkness. Its runes speak of a shadow that will come again. Maybe the myth of Fimbul Winter was a way of admitting that the world keeps its traumas like fossils. The first signs of the end would be familiar: winds rising from every direction, trees cracking from the cold, people turning on each other when firewood ran out. The bond between gods and humans, already frayed, would finally snap. Brothers would fight brothers, parents would abandon children, loyalty would melt faster than snow near the hearth. The social fabric, so carefully woven by the Norns, would unravel thread by thread. Even the sun and moon, those faithful runners across the sky, would falter. The wolves that had chased them since the beginning would finally catch up. One would swallow the sun, another the moon. The world would go dark, not metaphorically but literally. In that darkness, everything lost its outline. Mountains, oceans, hope. The rivers would freeze to stone, and from the edge of the world, the ship Naglfar would creak free from its moorings. It was built, the myths say, from the nails of the dead, a poetic way of describing how despair builds momentum. On it sailed Loki, newly freed from his chains, his face still marked by venom and fury. At his side stood the giants and monsters, Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the serpent, all the things the gods had tried to bury. Every fear they had postponed was now punctual. It's tempting to hear this as pure apocalypse, but in the Norse sense it was more natural disaster than divine decree. The world was designed to break. Even Yggdrasil, the great tree, trembled, shedding leaves that fell like exhausted stars. The gods did not rage against fate, they prepared for it. Odin assembled his warriors, knowing full well he would lose. Thor tightened his grip on Mjolnir, already hearing the hiss of the serpent beneath the waves. Freyja's tears froze on her cheeks, glittering like tiny prophecies. There's a strange calm in this myth. The gods know the outcome but still choose to fight. That's their version of faith, not in survival, but in continuity. They believe that to resist the end, even briefly, was an act of honour. It's a worldview both fatalistic and strangely uplifting. The point isn't to win, it's to stand your ground while the universe folds around you. Outside, in the mortal world, people imagined what Fimbulwinter would sound like. Maybe the groan of trees splitting in the frost, the silence after birds stop singing, or the creak of ice expanding on a lake. You can picture them huddled by firelight, telling these stories not to terrify each other but to make sense of hardship. The myth was a mirror. Each real winter became rehearsal for the final one. Surviving another season meant postponing the end of days. It's easy to miss the humour buried in all this gloom. When the world's temperature drops for 3 consecutive years, even the gods need coping mechanisms. Thor would probably have tried to hammer the weather back into shape. Loki would have blamed the supply chain. Odin would have written a very long poem about it. In the north, laughter was not denial, it was insulation. The image of endless winter has never really left us. Modern people call it by other names: collapse, crisis, extinction. But the feeling is the same. The light growing thin, the future shortening, the quiet question of what endures when everything else stops working. The Norse answer was simple and oddly gentle. Memory. Someone, something will remember. When you step outside on a winter night and the world feels too still, you can almost imagine Fimbulwinter beginning. Not as punishment, but as pause. Snow absorbs sound, air turns to glass. Time itself seems to slow, waiting to see who moves first. In the myth, the gods are still. The frost creeps over Asgard's gates. Fires die in the hearths of men. And yet, under all that silence, the first stirrings of the next act are already there. The great wolf's breath steams against the stars. The serpent twists in its frozen sea, and far away the green heart of the world keeps a secret no cold can reach. Because even the longest winter has to end. It started as endings often do with bad weather. It will end as beginnings often do with something small, maybe a spark, maybe a seed, maybe a memory that refuses to die. For now the wind howls across the empty sky, and the gods tighten their cloaks, waiting for the storm that never stops arriving. Then they realise the forecast is permanent. When the long winter finally ended, it didn't bring spring. It brought fire. Out of the frozen seas and broken sky came motion again. Not the kind that heals, but the kind that burns through everything old. It was the beginning of the end, or perhaps the only ending the world had ever been built for. The poets called it Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. It's a title that sounds like a closing ceremony, but it's really a chain reaction. Every old promise snaps at once. The first sign was the breaking of bonds. The wolf Fenrir, chained for ages, with a ribbon forged from impossible things. The sound of a cat's footsteps, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, finally tore free. The earth shook, mountains split, the sea rose, and from its depths the serpent Jormungandr uncoiled, huge enough to circle the world. Its movement alone made waves that drowned coastlines. Overhead the sun and moon were gone, eaten by their pursuers. In the light of fire and lightning, every creature saw the shape of its doom clearly and without panic. There was no point pretending otherwise. The ship Naglfar slid from the ice carrying giants, the dead, and Loki himself, returned from his cave scarred by venom, smiling like someone arriving late to a party he never liked. Across the plain of Vigrid, the armies gathered, gods, monsters, and mortals whose courage outweighed their odds. It's said the plain was so wide that even Odin's ravens needed days to fly across it. Though distance didn't matter anymore, the end had already filled all available space. Odin rode at the front on his 8-legged horse, Sleipnir, his spear Gungnir shining like frostbitten starlight. Behind him came the Einherjar, warriors of Valhalla, already dead once and happy to repeat the experiment. Thor marched with them, hammer in hand, lightning humming around him. Frey rode into battle with a sword that could fight by itself, though he'd traded it long ago for love, which made this his worst day for sentimentality. Even Tyr, the one-handed god of justice, returned to meet the monstrous hound Garm, proof that cosmic order sometimes has to settle accounts personally. When they clashed, the sound wasn't war as we imagine it. There were no trumpets, no cheering, just the long, steady roar of inevitability. The sky split open, fire pouring through like water. Yggdrasil trembled. The gods fought not for victory but for memory, to make sure the story was worth retelling afterward. Odin faced Fenrir and was swallowed whole, swallowed the way light disappears into a storm cloud. Thor killed the serpent, but only after staggering 9 steps before falling himself, poisoned by the creature's breath. The world, always fond of symmetry, gave them both the same silence. Even the fire had purpose. Surtur, the giant of flame, walked across the battlefield with his sword burning hotter than the sun. Every step turned green fields to glass. When he reached the end, he raised his blade and the world itself caught fire. Forests, oceans, cities, and sky all became one sound, the crackling sigh of things returning to their simplest form. It might sound like horror, but the old poets wrote it differently. They called it cleansing. Fire and water, the 2 oldest powers, washing and burning away the clutter. The gods' deaths were not punishments, just the end of their shift. Even the monsters performed their roles faithfully. Fenrir's jaws split the heavens not out of malice, but because that was how the script was, written. Ragnarok was less a battle than a release, the universe exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Somewhere within the flames you can imagine Odin's ravens circling, recording, remembering. Their feathers smoulder, but they keep flying. Somewhere else a piece of Yggdrasil still stands, blackened but alive, holding the weight of all that was. And deep beneath the ash, 2 humans hide in the roots, waiting for the fire to pass. Lif and Lifthrasir, whose names mean life and life lover. They will be the start of something new, though they don't know it yet. It's easy to think of Ragnarok as destruction, but it's really a kind of recycling. The world was built from a body. It ends by becoming one again. Matter breaking down into possibility. In modern language, we'd call it entropy. In theirs, it was renewal by other means. What's remarkable is how quietly the myth ends. There's no triumph, no lament. After the roar fades, there's just soundless brightness, the way snow muffles a landscape after a blizzard. Everything burned, everything remembered. You can almost picture it. A sky glowing red, waves hissing on molten rock, the air thick with ash and steam. Then, slowly, the fire sinks back into the earth. The wind cools, the first new dawn stretches across an empty world, and in that fragile light nothing looks destroyed, only ready. The gods knew this was coming and chose to face it anyway. That may be the real lesson buried in all the doom. That meaning lies not in prevention, but participation. They fought not to win, but to keep the rhythm going, to prove that existence was still worth showing up for, even at the final curtain. Some listeners find the story bleak, others find it strangely peaceful, an ending that refuses despair because it accepts it completely. The Norse didn't expect eternity, they expected cycles, growth, decay, return. Ragnarok wasn't the death of the world, it was the pause before the next one remembered how to breathe. And somewhere, far beyond the smoke, a green light is waiting. When the fire finally quiets, when even the echoes stop echoing, there's just warmth, the leftover glow of something that ended properly. You might call it destruction. The Norse would call it maintenance. And when it was over, something quietly green stirred. When the fires of Ragnarok sank into silence, there was nothing left that looked alive. The seas boiled, the mountains had collapsed into black glass, and the air was thick with the smell of iron and ash. For a time, though time itself had stopped meaning much, the world floated in a kind of exhausted stillness. If you had been there, you might have thought it was finished, but endings are rarely so tidy. Somewhere beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, in a sheltered hollow untouched by flame, two small figures stirred. They were not gods or giants, not even heroes, just people, Lif and Liftrasir, whose names mean life and life lover. They had hidden themselves during the cataclysm, drinking morning dew for sustenance, listening as the world above them burned and cooled. When at last the air smelled clean again, they climbed out. The sight that met them was strange and almost gentle. The ground, still warm, steamed under a pale sky. Rivers of melted stone glowed faintly in the distance, and then, impossibly, a sprout pushed through the soot. It wasn't much, just a stalk of green, trembling as if surprised by its own existence. But that was enough. The first colour to return after apocalypse was not red or gold, but the quiet green of forgiveness. The old poet said the earth would rise again from the sea, reborn and clean. Mountains would reform, trees would grow, and waterfalls would sparkle where fire once raged. The sun, devoured earlier by the wolf, would be replaced by her daughter, a new light for a new cycle. The surviving gods, fewer and humbler, would emerge to walk through the ruins of Asgard. Their old halls gone, their thrones cooled to stone. They would speak softly, not of power, but of remembering. Balder, the bright god of innocence who had died long ago, would return from the underworld, bringing with him a sense that grief itself might be reversible. Even Herda, his accidental killer, would come back, and the two would forgive each other. The universe, it seems, believed in reconciliation after exhaustion. It's tempting to picture this rebirth in cinematic colour. Sunlight breaking through clouds, the triumphant score swelling. But the Norse version is quieter. There's no cheering, no applause, just wind moving over new grass, rivers whispering over clean stones, and a sky so calm it feels like a held breath. After all that thunder and flame, the world restarts as a whisper. Lif and Lifthrasir would wander through this landscape collecting food, naming things and perhaps rediscovering words. They were humanity's second draft. No cities yet, no ships, no runestones, just the gentle astonishment of being alive again. They didn't rebuild Asgard or seek revenge. They simply lived, which, in this mythology, was the point all along. The green world after Ragnarok isn't paradise, it's just possibility. There are no promises that this version of creation will avoid the same mistakes. It might last forever, or until the next imbalance of fire and ice. But its very existence carries a small, stubborn optimism that life, given even the smallest chance, will find a way to sprout again. In a sense, the Norse didn't imagine a happy ending so much as a merciful one. Their gods die, their heroes fall, their world collapses, but nothing stays dead. The cycle resets not because anyone deserves it, but because nature doesn't know how to stop. It's a world view born from long winters and short summers. You endure, you thaw, you begin again. Modern readers sometimes miss the beauty of that simplicity. The myth isn't about punishment or reward, it's about resilience. The gods themselves don't escape judgment. They just accept it and keep going. When the world restarts, it's not handed back to Odin or Thor, but to humanity. The divine retires, the ordinary inherits. You can imagine the sensory texture of that rebirth. Damp soil under bare feet, the sharp sweetness of clean air after fire, the hum of insects rediscovering work. The earth itself feels new but also familiar, like waking up in a house you forgot you built. Every sound is gentle, a contrast to the roaring chaos that came before. Even silence sounds different now, not as absence, but as space waiting to be filled. And in that space, perhaps the first human voices rise again. A conversation, a laugh, a song to mark the moment. They might not remember the old gods or the long chain of disasters that preceded them, but the rhythm of life itself carries those memories unconsciously. Somewhere the roots of Yggdrasil still stretch, connecting what was and what will be. This part of the myth feels less like a sequel, and more like a sigh of relief. The universe has exhaled. The soil is cooling, and from the ashes green shoots appear. The idea that life emerges from ruin isn't unique to the Norse, but their version has a kind of weathered honesty. It doesn't promise perfection, only renewal through fatigue. If you've ever walked outside after a storm and smelled the air, heavy and sweet with ozone, you've already experienced a fragment of this feeling. The calm isn't emptiness, it's the sound of the world resetting. The storytellers must have known that people needed this ending. They lived in a landscape that tested patience, winters that erased villages, summers that could vanish overnight. They didn't need a paradise after death. They needed reassurance that destruction wasn't final. In that sense, the myth of the green world is not escapism, it's endurance poetry. When the sun rises again in those stories, it does so quietly. No angels sing, no divine hands applaud. The light simply arrives, as it always has, indifferent but generous. Birds return, cautious at first, then confident. Waves lap at new shores. The air smells faintly of salt and beginning. And if you listen closely, you might hear something underneath all that peace. Not words exactly, but the faint rhythm of breath, steady and human. Apparently, even the world needed a nap. And yet, somehow, the memory of all this survived. Even when the gods were gone, their stories refused to follow. The fires cooled, the world turned green again, and somewhere in that quiet new dawn, memory began its second life. You can almost imagine it. People sitting around new hearths, retelling what little they remembered, reshaping the chaos into words. That was how myth survived. Not through temples or armies, but through repetition. Someone always remembered enough to start again. For the Norse, survival was never just physical, it was narrative. To be remembered was to exist. A man who died in battle might live on in song. A stone with his name carved upon it could outlast his descendants. That idea didn't disappear when Christianity arrived, it simply changed shape. The missionaries who sailed north brought new stories, but they also borrowed from the old ones. Heaven inherited the architecture of Valhalla. Hell borrowed its name from Hel, the underworld goddess. Even the idea of a last judgment echoed Ragnarok, though in the Christian version the heroes stay dead and the bureaucrats win. The old gods didn't vanish overnight. They became habits of speech, shapes in weather, explanations for moods. Farmers still called on Thor when storms threatened the fields. Travellers traced small hammer symbols over doors, or carved them into lintels beside crosses just in case. The gelling stones in Denmark tell the same story in stone. One side praises Christ, the other still speaks the language of runes. It was less conversion than coexistence. Two faiths politely sharing a continent. In Iceland, where the sagas were written, the memory of pagan times was treated less as heresy than as heritage. Snorri Sturluson, centuries after the last ritual fires were lit, organised those memories into his prose Edda. He claimed it was for the education of poets, but it was also a kind of rescue mission. Without him, the names of Odin, Thor, Freyja and Loki might have faded into weather and folklore. Instead, they travelled by ink. The gods who once demanded sacrifice now survived through grammar. The irony of all this is charming. Christianity gave the old myths their best afterlife. The very religion that replaced them preserved them in writing, which the pagans themselves never did. It's the cultural equivalent of being fired from a job only to have your portrait hung in the lobby. As the centuries passed, the stories drifted into legend and then into literature. Medieval poets in Germany turned them into epics. Later, artists painted them on ceilings and tapestries. By the 19th century, Wagner gave them new thunder in his operas, complete with anvils, smoke, and very patient audiences. Scholars turned them into textbooks. Filmmakers and novelists revived them yet again, polishing their edges until they gleamed like new coins. Odin became a philosopher king, Thor a cheerful demigod, Loki a misunderstood genius. The modern versions are less frightening, but they serve the same function. They keep the echo alive. What's remarkable is how adaptable these myths have always been. They absorb whatever age retells them. In the medieval period, they were cautionary. In the Romantic era, heroic. In our time, entertaining. But beneath each translation lies the same pulse. The idea that order and chaos are roommates, that endings lead to beginnings, and that wisdom is always slightly too expensive. Even archaeology plays its part in this long memory. Every time a ship burial is uncovered or a new rune is translated, another voice re-enters the conversation. The bog-preserved hair of a sacrificed animal, the glint of a forgotten brooch, the traces of pigment on a runestone, all whisper the same thing. The people who believed these stories were real, and they built their world out of them. You can still visit those stones. The Jelling monuments stand in Denmark under a wide sky. The Røk stone rests quietly in a field, its runes faint but readable. Touching one is like shaking hands with someone who spoke a language that hasn't been heard aloud in 1,000 years. The air hums faintly around them. Not magic, just memory refusing to evaporate. And that's the heart of it. Myths are humanity's way of taking notes. They record not facts, but feelings. How it felt to be small under a cold sky, to hear thunder and imagine personality behind it, to watch the seasons die and return and wonder if the world was alive. Those feelings don't age. Even if you replace Odin with algorithms and Thor's hammer with meteorology, the impulse remains. We still tell stories to make the unknown friendly enough to face. The Norse myths endure because they never pretended to fix the world. They simply observed it. Messy, beautiful, temporary, and gave it a vocabulary. Creation was hard work, life was fragile, death was travel, and the end of everything was not the end. It was just the pause before someone new began carving another story into stone. Today, their descendants live in more literal forms. Movies, comics, video games. But even there, the old patterns linger. Heroes rise, fall, and rise again. Gods make mistakes. Tricksters steal the spotlight. The scenery changes. The pattern doesn't. It's the same conversation carried by new voices. And if you listen past the noise of modern retellings, you can still hear the tone of the old ones. That calm northern humour that refuses to dramatize even the apocalypse. Yes, it seems to say, the world ends, then it starts again. Would you like some soup? So perhaps it's no surprise that these stories keep returning, long after belief has gone quiet. They were never just about gods, they were about endurance. A mirror for anyone who's watched the world crack and still found the strength to plant something green afterward. The pagans lost, but their fan club only grew. Maybe that's the true magic. A story that ends, waits, and then begins again.